How are questions left unresolved in the Philadelphia Convention addressed in the 14th Amendment? And how are the due process and equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment related to the principles of limited government? Do I have somebody time?
All done.
Alright,
When you're ready, and they're ready, you may begin.
Thomas Jefferson once stated that the best principles of our republic secure to all its citizens a perfect equality of rights. Although the United States was founded on the idea that all men are created equal, the Philadelphia Convention purposely left the issues of slavery and citizenship ambiguous. The inclusion of the due process and equal protection clauses in the 14th Amendment not only protected citizenship, but also created a national veto power to check state governments.
In order to establish the protection of the individual and further the rights of freed slaves, the Radical Republicans passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. When the 13th Amendment was created, the status of former slaves became uncertain among the states. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship and overturned the court's decision in Scott v. Sanford in order to protect the newly recognized rights of former slaves and prevent state infringement on civil liberties. The Citizenship Clause would later allow children of immigrants born in the United States to be declared citizens, as upheld by United States v. Wong Kim Ark in 1898, and would in the 21st century spark debate over illegal immigrants claiming the rights to their U.S.-born children.
The principles of a limited government extended through Section 1, Clause 2 of the 14th Amendment by directly prohibiting states from infringing on citizens, thus resolving the ambiguity between states and individuals left by the Philadelphia Convention. Cases such as Barron v. Baltimore set the precedent to discount courts' influence on account of the rights of citizens. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment became the basis for legal equality, thus limiting both states and national governments. The slaughterhouse cases continued the precedent of Barron v. Baltimore until Gitlow v. New York, in which the Supreme Court used the process of incorporation to apply the Due Process Clause to other amendments in order to protect people's rights from state interference, thus providing a check upon the state power.
14th Amendment limits the states through substantive and procedural due process. Substantive due process guarantees the protection of fundamental rights by the law, while procedural due process establishes the fairness of the enforcement of said law, such as the right to trial by a jury or the reading of Miranda rights. The enforcement of equal protection through Section 1, Clause 3 of the 14th Amendment further upheld the rights of the individual through Brown v. Board of Education by overturning the separate but equal ruling, lessening the control of the government on civil matters. In later ruling, due process expanded beyond the right of fair law to the rights of privacy as seen through Roe v. Wade and to the rights of freedom of contract through Allgaier versus Louisiana.
The 14th Amendment gave Congress the power to enforce the equality promised by the 13th Amendment, providing a much-needed check on state government. Although ineffectual during the Reconstruction, i.e. the Black Codes and Grandfather Clause, the process of incorporation has allowed for the enforcement of other amendments. This, along with equal protection, will become critical for the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, and modern-day immigration and gay rights.
313.
What limitations are there upon the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment?
The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is also applied to the states, and so by applying it to the states, it means that all people in front of a jury are equal. It means even if you have a black person versus a white person, especially during the Reconstruction era, it means that they're represented fairly in front of a jury. It means that they both have the same rights. It means they both have the right to a lawyer. They don't have to merely represent themselves. And that's how this is starting to not only apply to it applies to the states in this way.
It also has another weakness with for the Equal Protection Clause to be applied, the person has to be inside the United States. Guantanamo Bay is located in Cuba, so the 14th Amendment does not apply to any.
But isn't it subject to the jurisdiction thereof?
What?
Isn't it subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Even though it's in Cuba, isn't Guantanamo part of the United States?
In a sense, but they're not part of the United States.
So where does the 14th Amendment say it has to apply directly in the United States?
It says to the people of the United States.
Subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
I'm sure we go with that.
Let's
else?
take it one step farther, and that is how does the 14th Amendment protect detainees Guantanamo Bay?
They have the right to lawyers, and these lawyers fight for their detainees.
Now, is that the 14th Amendment that does that, or is that the 5th Amendment that does that?
On the due process clause of the 14th Amendment was given to all people by the 14th Amendment.
But people who are detained in Guantanamo Bay, many of them are not U.S. citizens. So are we saying the 14th Amendment only applies to U.S. citizens?
The 14th Amendment applies to both the national and the state governments, and so it's creating the precedent for all jurisdiction in which the United States has an interest in, whether it's states, province, or the national government.
Don't scratch your head. Wait before the judge.
The 14th Amendment, as you guys pointed out, was brought into use to protect the newly freed African American slaves. Why is it not till 1965, 100 years after its ratification, does it finally really start getting its implementation?
It finally starts to get its implementation because you still have to see the changes in society willing to use it. You still have to have the Supreme Court overturn its decisions. We do see the Dred Scott v. Sanford case. We see the other cases where you have this discrimination against people, and yet you have to overturn it gradually, and that's why it ended up being in the 1960s, especially with Brown v. Board of Education, is because it takes time for precedent to set in the minds of the people, but you've established the law for future generations.
As well as the 14th Amendment didn't apply directly to the states for a while after it was ratified, so it took a while to become upheld through all citizens.
And also, the idea of judicial restraint, insofar as that the Supreme Court judges just didn't want to impose themselves politically on the political sphere, and rather wanted to they wanted to be more conservative in their decisions and kind of preserve the history of the laws rather than proactively changing them.
You guys, in your testimony, talked about substantive due process, not substantive, substantive due process, and procedural due process. Neither one is actually in the Constitution, substantive or procedural. How are they, in fact, then a process of due process, or how do they function under due process?
They function under due process because of the interpretation of due process. There's two ways you have to interpret it, both the laws and the way those laws are upheld, and that's where you get both substantive and substantive and procedural due process, because you can't just say, yes, you're equal in front of the law. You have to also say whether or not those laws are constitutional, and that's how this
Can you
case
give me an example?
unconstitutional. The current case with the Affordable Care Act is for the Sebelius, and the fact that they had to deem that whether that was constitutional, and that's where you see the
Is that due process?
It's due process in the sense of, like, you still have to, you're looking at whether or not it affects people and if they're still being upheld under the law. Like, placing people and forcing them to have health care may not be creating equality under the law for everyone, because you're still discriminating against
So is
people.
that substantive or procedural?
Procedural. But that is one.
Where's the
It's an example of how you have to both determine the different ways of due process, because it's not just in the courts or just law.
Let's stop the camera.
You talked about the